The timber's still there, if you know where to look for it, gray as an old man's knuckle, half swallowed by a chokecherry bush that's had 40 years to work at it. I stopped my granddaughter with a hand on her shoulder, right where the trail bends around the tailings pile, and I said, "You see that post there, leaning like it's tired?" She said she saw it. I told her that post was older than her grandfather's first gray hair, and that was saying something, because by September of 1897 I had plenty. We stood there a while, the two of us, the wind coming down off the saddle the way it always does in the afternoon, smelling like snow that hadn't decided to fall yet. Below us, the gulch ran green-gray with willow and old rock, and if you didn't know what you were looking at, you'd have called it just another played-out hollow in the Mosquito Range, one of 1,000 such scars the mining years left on Park County. But I knew what I was looking at. I'd carried rock out of that ground with my own 2 hands, 26 days of it, back when I was younger than she is now. She asked me, the way children ask things, half wanting the answer and half wanting only the sound of an old man's voice, whether it was true what her father said, that the claim had been given away as a joke. I told her it was true, every word of it. I told her that on a Wednesday, the 9th of September, 1868, my brother Marcus and I walked into the Park County Assay and Exchange office in Alma with $6.40 between us, a Sharp's carbine we shared, a hand axe with a cracked haft, and not much else to our names. I was 17 that year. Marcus was 23, and he did the deciding for both of us, same as he'd done since our father died, and left us the road instead of a home. She wanted to know what was funny about a claim. I said, well, that's the thing about a joke. It depends entirely on who's laughing, and when. There was a clerk behind that counter, heavy-set, balding, the kind of man who'd never swung a pick in his life, but had opinions about the men who did. He had a claim on his ledger nobody wanted, the Half Moon, recorded back in '48 by some prospector who'd vanished off the record 20 years before we ever walked in, and it sat buried clean under a rockslide nobody in 3 mining seasons had bothered to touch. He handed it to us laughing, my granddaughter. Told us it was the only land 2 penniless drifters would ever own. I let that sit with her a moment, the wind moving through the willows, the old timber leaning against its 40 years. Well, I said, he wasn't wrong that it was ours. He was wrong about everything else. She sat down on a flat stone, the way she does when she means to stay a while, and I settled beside her, my knees complaining the way old knees do, and I started the story where it needs to start, not with the silver, not yet, but with the rock. Wednesday, the 9th of September, 1868. I remember the date the way a man remembers the day he was married, or the day he buried someone, because it turned out to be both of those things at once, though I didn't know it yet standing in that doorway with snow melt soaking through the seams of my boots. We'd come down out of the pass 2 days before, off a trail that had chewed through what was left of our second pair of socks, and we walked into Alma with $6.40 between us, counted twice by my brother, because he didn't trust the first count. Marcus was 23 then, though the mountains had already put 30 years into his hands. I was 17, and I still believed, some mornings, that things would come easy if we were patient enough. We had 1 Sharp's carbine we shared and traded off carrying, a hand axe with a haft cracked clean through and bound with wet rawhide, a tin cup, 40 pounds of cornmeal wrapped in oilcloth, 2 wool blankets gone thin at the fold, and the journal I kept because our mother had kept one, and it felt like carrying a piece of her forward. Alma wasn't much of a town that year, a scatter of log buildings, a stamp mill working somewhere up the gulch, men moving through the mud, with the particular hurry of fellows who believed silver was still to be had if they got there before the next man. We went looking for work, digging, hauling, anything that paid in coin instead of promises. Every door we tried had already been tried by someone hungrier or luckier that same week. The assay office was the last stop before we'd have turned back toward the pass with nothing to show for the walk. The clerk behind the counter didn't even ask our names before he asked what we were good for, and Marcus told him, strong backs, patience, no fear of cold. The clerk laughed at that, not unkindly exactly, but the way a man laughs at a joke he's told himself 100 times and still finds funny. He had a ledger open in front of him, and he turned it toward us like he was doing us a favor, tapping a line near the bottom of a page gone soft at the corners. The half moon, he said, recorded in 48, buried under half a mountainside for as long as anybody in this camp can remember, and not one soul fool enough to touch it since. He slid a sheet of paper across the counter, the transfer, already drawn up, like he'd been saving it for the next pair of fools who walked through his door. "Congratulations, boys," he said, and there was a wet shine in his eyes from holding back the laugh. "You're landowners now. Only land two drifters like you will ever call your own." We signed our names, mine still a little uneven from the cold, Marcus's steady as a bank draft, and the clerk stamped the paper twice like he wanted to be sure it stuck. Neither of us said much walking out. There wasn't much to say to a man who'd just handed you a joke wrapped up as a deed. We asked a fellow outside the mercantile which way to the half moon, and he pointed us up the gulch north of camp, without even looking up from the harness he was mending. 2 miles, he said. You'll know it when you see it. Can't miss what can't be worked. The walk took the better part of an hour, the trail thinning to a game path and then to nothing at all, just the shape of the gulch telling us where to put our feet. The air thinned with the climb, and I remember my chest working harder than it should have for a boy of 17 who'd walked 200 miles to get here. Marcus didn't slow. He never did. We came around a shoulder of rock a little past 4 o'clock, the light already going long and gold, the way it does early in September at that elevation, and there it was. Not a mine, not even the ghost of one, just a slope of broken stone maybe 40 feet across and twice that high, gray and rust-colored, spilled down from somewhere above like the mountain had shrugged. Nothing about it said shaft or claim or anything a man could put a deed to. It said only that something up top had let go a long time ago and come down hard. Marcus stood with his hands on his hips and didn't say anything for a good while. I picked up a chunk of the talus, turned it over. Nothing to it. Ordinary rock, sharp-edged, the kind that skins your palms if you're careless. Snow had come to the peaks above us sometime in the last day or two. Not on us yet, but close. A fine white dusting on the shoulders of the range that hadn't been there when we'd crossed the pass 4 days earlier. Marcus looked up at that longer than he looked at the Rockslide. Early, he said. For September. I asked him what he wanted to do, though I already knew, the way you know your brother's mind before he's finished making it up himself. He crouched down and set his hand flat against the stone, like he was taking the mountain's pulse. We paid nothing for this, he said. Man wanted it off his books. That's worth something, even if it ain't worth much. I didn't answer right away. I was looking past him at the size of the thing, 40 feet of rock stacked who knew how deep, no tools between us but a hand axe with a cracked haft, and whatever patience the Lord had seen fit to give 2 brothers with $6.40, and a whole winter coming on behind that snow. Marcus stood, dusted his hands on his trousers, and looked at me the way he always did when the deciding was already done, and all that was left was telling me. We'll want a spot for a fire, he said, before dark. We made camp that first night in the lee of a stand of spruce maybe 60 yards back from the slide, close enough to hear the creek, but far enough that if more rock let go in the night, we wouldn't be under it. My brother was particular about that kind of thing, the way careful men are particular, without making a show of it. We didn't talk much while we worked. He cut boughs for a bed, and I dug a fire pit and lined it with stones, the way our father had shown us before he passed, and by full dark, we had a small fire going, and the cornmeal measured out in the tin cup, 1/3 of a cup each, boiled thin with creek water, which he said would need to last us if the clearing took as long as he suspected it would. I asked him how long he suspected. He didn't answer that either, not directly. He looked at the slide a long while, chewing on nothing, the fire throwing his shadow long across the rock. Man clears 40 feet of loose stone with his hands, he finally said. It goes slow at first and slower after that. But it goes. Everything goes, given enough mornings. I wrote that down later, in the journal I kept, because it sounded like something worth keeping, even if I didn't yet understand why. We started at first light. September 9th, a Wednesday, cold enough that our breath hung in the air past sunrise and didn't fully burn off till near 8 o'clock. Marcus worked the top of the slide, where the stones were smaller, loosened by the last snow melt, and easy enough for one man to walk down the pile without it giving way beneath him. I worked lower, where the rock had settled heavier, moving what I could two-handed and dragging the rest with a length of rope looped through a stone we'd found with a natural neck to it, near flat, like it had been shaped for exactly that purpose by nobody's hand but the mountain's own. By noon we'd cleared maybe 4 feet of depth and not an inch of the 40 we needed. Marcus didn't say anything about the arithmetic of that. I did the figuring myself, lying awake that night listening to him breathe, working out that at 4 feet a day, which was optimistic, which assumed no bigger stones, no injury, no early storm, we were looking at 10 days minimum, maybe more once we hit whatever had actually caused the slide to begin with, be it a ledge collapse or a frost heave, or something worse underneath holding the whole pile together like a cork in a bottle. I didn't say any of that to him either. Some things a man works out for himself and carries alone until he's ready to set it down, and I understood by then that my brother was the kind of man who needed to arrive at the size of a problem in his own time, not have it handed to him by his younger brother lying 6 feet away in the dark, listening to the creak and waiting for morning. Morning came gray and stayed that way for the better part of 2 weeks, the kind of light that never quite commits to being day. We fell into a rhythm the way men do when there's no other choice available to them. Up before the sun to save the good hours for the heaviest stones, a fist of cornmeal mush each, no coffee because we hadn't the money for it, and then the work, which was not really work in any sense a man could take pride in. It was moving rock. Rock that did not want to be moved, that sat wedged against other rock in ways that seemed almost deliberate, though I knew better than to credit a mountain with intention. My hands split open along the second knuckles inside the first week, and Marcus's were worse, since he took the larger stones and left me the gravel and the shoveling. At night I'd grease what cracks I could reach with tallow we couldn't spare, and wrap them in strips torn from a shirt too far gone to wear. The cornmeal sack, which had weighed 40 pounds on the 9th of September, felt noticeably lighter by the 20th, though neither of us said so aloud, as if naming it would hasten the day it ran out entirely. The first hard freeze came on a Thursday night, and I remember it exactly, because I woke to find the creek edge stiffened white, and my breath hanging in the tent like smoke that wouldn't clear. After that, the ground fought us harder, frost gripping the smaller stones into the larger ones overnight, so that each morning undid a portion of what we'd gained the day before. Marcus took to breaking the topmost crust with the axe head before we could shift anything, and I took to keeping the journal by firelight most evenings, less because I had grand things to record, and more because writing something down made the day feel like it had amounted to a thing rather than simply passed through me. It was in those pages, on what I marked as the 4th of October. No, I'm getting ahead of the count. It was closer to the middle of the work, somewhere past 2 weeks in, that I first wrote down the business of the chisel marks. We'd uncovered a shelf of gray stone jutting from the slide, not part of the rubble itself but bedrock beneath it, and along its face ran 3 parallel gouges, old ones, their edges softened by weather in a way fresh tool marks never are. They didn't match anything a rockslide would produce, and they didn't match the shallow test pits other claim jumpers had left scattered through the gulch either. I noted the depth of each gouge, the spacing between them, near 4 inches apart and dead straight, like a man had stood in that exact spot with purpose and struck the same 3 lines more than once. I didn't think much of it that night beyond curiosity. I only wrote it down because it didn't belong, and because a thing that doesn't belong is usually worth remembering later, even if you can't yet say why. My grandson would tell you I slow down whenever I get to this part, and he'd be right, because even 66 years old and telling it for the 100th time, I still feel my hands go cold remembering the morning of the 5th. We'd fallen into a rhythm by then that didn't require much talking. One of us worked the slide with the shovel, while the other hauled the loosened rock back down the gulch in a sling made from a torn blanket, and we traded off every hour or so without discussing it, the way men do when they've been at a thing long enough that their bodies keep the schedule better than their minds. That morning the air had the particular stillness that comes before real cold, no wind at all, the kind of quiet that makes every sound of iron on stone carry twice as far as it should. I remember my brother's shovel struck something that didn't give the way rubble gives. It rang. He stopped. I stopped hauling and came back up. What we'd taken for another slab of loose rock was in fact a timber, or the end of one, black with age and half-rotted, wedged crosswise against a shape behind it that was too regular to be anything the mountain had made on its own. We worked slower after that, careful the way you get careful when you sense you've stopped digging out a nuisance and started digging into something somebody built. It took the better part of that day to clear enough to see what we had, and what we had was a doorway, or what had been one. Timbers laid up in the old style, square set, half collapsed inward, with a gap along the top corner just wide enough to push a lantern through. My brother went first, on his stomach, and I held the light for him until he called back that it opened up beyond the gap, and then I went in after. The air inside was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season, still and heavy and smelling of old iron and wet rock and something else underneath that I didn't have a word for then and only later understood was simply time, the smell of a place sealed against the world for 20 years. The lantern showed us a shaft no more than 5 feet high, timbered along its length, and not 4 steps in stood a cart, iron-wheeled, or it had been. One wheel had rusted through and collapsed the frame sideways, and it was half-loaded still, gray ore piled in it, exactly as some man had left it, undisturbed, waiting on a delivery that had never come. Beyond the cart, leaning against the wall, a pick and a shovel stood upright, blades down in the dirt, the way a man leaves his tools when he means to come back the same afternoon. Nobody had touched any of it in 20 years. You could feel that in the stillness of the place, the way a room feels different when it's been empty a long while rather than just a moment. I looked at my brother, and he looked at me, and neither one of us said a word for what felt like a very long time. Marcus went in first, the way he always did, one hand on the lantern and the other trailing the wall like he expected it to move. I came behind with the axe, more for something to hold than any use I thought it might be. The pick against the wall had a haft split down its length, dry rotted at the grain, and when I turned it toward the light, I saw the letters cut into the wood, deep and deliberate, the kind of carving a man does on a long evening when there's nothing else to occupy his hands. A period, then H, nothing more. I ran my thumb over it the way you'd touch a name on a stone, though it would be another 11 days before I knew whose name it was. We went in maybe 30 feet before the shaft narrowed, and the timbering gave out to bare rock, and it was there the ceiling had come down, not all at once from the look of it, but in 2 falls, one older than the other, the second one burying whatever remained of the first. Marcus held the lantern up to it, and neither of us said the word out loud, but we were both thinking the same thing, that somewhere under that second fall was likely the reason the first man's tools had sat untouched for 2 decades. I have handled a great many things in my life since that day that turned out to hold more weight than their size suggested, and none of them sat in my hand the way that thought did, standing in a dead man's shaft with my brother's shadow thrown huge against the wall. It was Marcus who found the journal, wedged between 2 loose stones near where the pick had stood, wrapped in a scrap of oiled canvas that had rotted through in places and let the damp in regardless. The pages had swollen and stuck together, most of them gone to pulp at the edges, but the middle third had survived enough that when we pried it open, carefully, the way you'd open a hand you weren't sure still had feeling in it, we could see marks. Not words, not mostly. Lines. A crude sketch of the shaft itself, or what looked like it, with an arrow driven down and to the left past where the rockfall now sat, and beside it a scratch of numbers too water-stained to read with the lantern light we had. Marcus closed it slow, and put it inside his coat like it was a thing that could still be hurt. We didn't talk much on the walk back down to camp that evening. I remember the cold coming up out of the ground the way it does once the sun drops behind the range, and I remember thinking that whoever had cut those initials into that haft had likely stood in that same cold 100 times, thinking he had all the time left in the world to finish what he'd started. It would take a trip back down to Alma, and a clerk with better things to do than pull an old ledger for 2 ragged boys, before that man had a name at all. That evening we built the fire bigger than we ought to have, considering how thin the woodpile had gotten, but there are nights a man needs light more than he needs to be sensible about it. Marcus laid the journal open on a flat rock near the flames, and we went at those pages the way you'd pick through a creek bed for color, slow, patient, turning each one at an angle to catch what the water hadn't taken. Most of it was gone. Whole pages had gone to pulp and dried again into something like bark, and what writing remained had bled into itself until the letters wore each other's faces. But here and there a line held. Struck color Tuesday last. Rock talks different past the 40-foot mark. Listen for it. Out of salt pork, no matter, close now. That last one sat by itself near the back, and neither of us said anything about it for a while. Tucked in against the spine, where the water hadn't reached quite as bad, we found a tintype. A man, maybe 35, maybe older. Hard to say, the sun and the years having done to him what they do to most men out here early. He stood stiff the way they all stand in those pictures, like they've been told not to breathe, and behind him you could just make out the shape of a sluice box and a shovel leaned against a stump. He wasn't smiling. I don't suppose there was much reason to. He was close, Marcus said, finally, turning the last legible page toward the fire so he could read it again. Reads like he knew he was close. I thought about that a long while, watching the tintype curl slightly at one corner from the heat, though I pulled it back before it could take real damage. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes over a man when he understands somebody else's ending better than that somebody ever did themselves. This fellow, whoever he'd end up being once we had a name to put to him, had stood in this same gulch, maybe on this same flat rock, certain he had another season in him, another month, another week, and the mountain had disagreed. He left the vein for us, I said, not meaning it the way it sounded once it was out of my mouth, not like providence, not like a gift wrapped and waiting, more like a debt nobody had settled. Marcus didn't answer that. He closed the journal again, careful, and set it inside his coat, where it had ridden all the way down from the shaft. I lay back against my saddle roll and looked up at what stars the firelight let through, and I recall thinking that finishing another man's work is a strange kind of inheritance. You don't get his luck along with his labor, only the labor, and whatever the mountain decided about the rest was still entirely its own business. We took up the chalk marks the next morning. Thursday it must have been, though by then the days had stopped announcing themselves by name and just came one after another, gray and cold and smelling of wet rock. Hargrove had left himself a kind of language on the walls. Arrows scratched shallow, a series of dashes that Marcus decided meant paces, and every so often a crude X where, near as we could work out, he'd stopped to test the rock and found it wanting. We followed those marks the way you'd follow a man's handwriting in a letter, guessing at his meaning more than reading it outright. 60 feet past where his own tunnel gave out, past the old cart, past the last timber he'd set before the mountain took him, the walls changed. I noticed it before Marcus said anything, a seam of gray-white running crooked through the dark rock, catching the lantern light in a way that plain stone doesn't. Marcus put his thumbnail to it, then his knife, and came away with a curl of ore that looked nothing like what we'd been hauling out for 2 weeks. Neither of us said much. There wasn't much to say that wouldn't have sounded foolish out loud in that narrow, dark, 2 boys with a candle lamp and a dead man's map, standing over what might have been the thing that killed him and the thing he'd died chasing, both at once. We'd worked maybe another 4 feet past the seam when the shaft groaned. It wasn't loud. That was the strange part. I'd expected something like thunder if the mountain ever spoke, and instead it was closer to a man settling into a chair that's too small for him, a long, low creak that came from everywhere and nowhere. Dust sifted down from a crossbeam we hadn't even flagged as a concern. Marcus had his hand on my shoulder before I'd finished turning my head, already pulling us both back toward the entrance, slow and even, the way you'd back away from a horse deciding whether to kick. We stood outside a long while after, breathing harder than the walkout accounted for, looking at that dark opening like it might follow us. Marcus didn't say we were stopping. He didn't have to. We both understood, the way you understand weather coming, that Hargrove hadn't quit 60 feet short of that vein because he lacked the sand to keep digging. He'd quit because something in him had heard exactly what we'd just heard and hadn't lived long enough to heed it twice. So we didn't go back in the next morning. We spent that day and the 8 after it doing work that had nothing to do with silver, cutting lodgepole pine off the slope above the gulch, dragging it down on our shoulders, notching it by lamplight until our hands were too raw to feel the axe handle anymore. Marcus had learned timbering from a Cornish miner back in Central City the winter before, or claimed to, and I never once asked him to prove it, because doubting him would have meant doubting the only thing standing between us and what happened to Hargrove. We went in, an inch at a time after that. Marcus would set a post, wedge it, test it with his whole weight thrown against it, and only then let me pass under it with the pick. We flagged every crossbeam with chalk, whether it looked sound or not, because Hargrove hadn't flagged the one that killed him, and that seemed to us the whole of the lesson. Some days we shored 8 feet of tunnel and moved not one shovelful of ore. Some days we moved nothing at all, just stood listening to timber settle, waiting to hear if it was the good kind of quiet or the kind that came before a groan. The nights turned harder in that stretch. Frost came most mornings by the 14th of October, and our cornmeal was down to a coffee tin's worth, which meant fewer, thinner cakes and longer stretches lying awake listening to my own stomach instead of sleeping. Marcus never mentioned it. He'd hand me the larger half without comment and eat his own like it satisfied him, and I let him, the way you let an older brother keep the one lie that costs him something. By the 23rd day past finding the vein, we had 41 feet of new shaft framed solid behind us, each set of timbers tested twice, and Marcus had stopped flinching at every groan the mountain gave, because he'd learned, the way you learn a dog's bark, which ones meant something and which ones didn't. I can't say I ever stopped flinching. I don't think a man's meant to get comfortable underground. I think the ones who do are the ones the mountain eventually collects. What I can say is that on the morning of October the 28th, standing at the new working face with the lamp throwing more shadow than light, Marcus set his palm flat against the rock and said, the only prayer I ever heard him say that wasn't for our mother. I didn't ask what the prayer was. Some things a younger brother learns not to ask, the same way he learns not to look too long at a man's face when he thinks nobody's watching. We worked that face for 6 more days, careful days, the kind where you swing the pick like you're asking the mountain's permission instead of taking something from it. On the 3rd of November, a Tuesday by my count in the journal, we broke into ore that didn't look like anything we'd pulled before, dark, heavy, streaked through with a metal sheen that caught the lamp and threw it back at us. Marcus held a chunk of it in his palm for a long while without saying anything, turning it the way a man turns a coin he isn't sure is real. We filled 2 grain sacks with the best of it, maybe 30 pounds between them, and left the rest where it sat, because we'd learned by then that the mountain wasn't going anywhere, and neither were we. The walk down to Alma took the better part of a day, the sacks cutting into our shoulders in a way that felt, I'll admit, better than any weight had felt on that trail in weeks. We didn't talk much. There wasn't a plan to discuss beyond the obvious one, the assay office, the scale, the truth of what we'd found written down by somebody other than ourselves. The same clerk was behind the counter. He looked heavier than I remembered, or maybe I'd just gotten used to looking at rock and timber and forgot what a soft man looked like. He didn't recognize us at first. 2 drifters were 2 drifters to him, I suppose, until you set 30 pounds of silver-bearing ore on his counter and watch his face do the arithmetic. He ran the sample twice. I remember that, because the second time he didn't say a word, just wrote the figures down slower than he had to, like he was giving himself time to believe them. Marcus asked him plain what it would cost to file proper, through the office. No favors and no jokes this time. The clerk told him $12, and Marcus counted it out from what little we'd carried down, coin by coin, onto the counter between them, not looking up once. The clerk took the money and wrote the receipt, and for a moment his pen just hovered there over the paper, like he had something else he wanted to put down, and didn't have the words for it yet. Then he set the pen down and looked at Marcus, and then at me, and something in his face had gone loose, the way a man's face goes when he stops holding a thing up. I want you boys to know, he said, I never figured you'd last the week. Nobody said anything to that. Marcus took the receipt, folded it once, put it inside his coat where he kept things that mattered. I remember the clerk's hand still resting on the counter next to the little stack of ore, like he wasn't sure yet whether to touch it again. We didn't gloat. There wasn't any pleasure in it that needed saying out loud. The pleasure was already spent, 26 days of it, 9 more after that, worked into our backs and our hands, and gone quiet, the way hard-won things go quiet. We shook his hand, both of us, and walked back out into the street, and that was the whole of it. That gulch is still working ground, up above where the timber gives out. Not a rich man's mine, never was, never got dressed up to be, but an honest one, worked square through every season since, paying wages to men who never knew the joke it started as. Marcus stayed with it the whole of his life. I didn't. I went other places, wrote other things down, and this is one of them. You're standing about where the old cart used to sit, before we hauled it out and set it by the shaft mouth as a marker. Cold up here even in September, isn't it? It was cold then, too. I think about that clerk sometimes, more now than I used to. He wasn't a cruel man, not really, just a man who'd never had to find out what he was made of, handing a joke to two boys who had no choice but to find out what they were made of instead. The mountain didn't care which one of us was laughing when that claim got drawn up. It never has cared, not once, not for anybody who's stood on it before or since. It just sits there being old, and it waits to see who stays. That's the whole story, near as I can tell it true. If it's put you in mind of something, a brother, a bit of ground, a thing somebody handed you as a joke that you made into something real, I'd like to hear it. Write it down. Somebody, someday, might be glad